The envelope was cream-colored, thick, and expensive. The kind powerful families use when they want cruelty to look beautiful. Soft jazz drifted through the ballroom while crystal glasses clinked beneath enormous chandeliers. More than 200 guests turned to stare as Richard Hale slowly walked toward his eldest daughter during his younger daughter's wedding reception. Rebecca Hale stood alone beside table 16 in her dark military dress uniform while cameras zoomed in on her face. Then her father handed her a formal disownment letter.
Right there.
In public, at her own sister's wedding.
"This is from all of us," he said.
The ballroom fell silent in that terrible wealthy people way, where everyone became quiet, not from shock, but anticipation. Everyone expected Rebecca to cry. Her sister Caroline certainly did. After years of humiliation, rejection, and emotional exile, Caroline wanted to watch her finally break apart in front of Charleston society. Instead, Rebecca calmly opened the letter. She read every word. Then she folded the pages once, twice, slid them into her purse, and smiled. That smile changed the entire night. Because nobody in that ballroom knew Rebecca had spent the last 6 years secretly preparing for this exact moment. Not her sister,
Not the guests,
and especially not her father. What none of them realized was that federal investigators were already on their way to the hotel. Rain hung low over Charleston Harbor the afternoon Rebecca Hale returned home. The city looked exactly the same as she remembered. Pastel buildings, church steeples, cobblestone streets, and wealthy tourists pretending Southern charm still existed naturally, instead of being carefully manufactured for people with money. Rebecca sat silently in the back of the Blacktown car while the driver glanced at her military dress uniform through the rearview mirror every few seconds. People always stared at the uniform, especially in the South. Her gold ribbons rested sharply against dark navy fabric. Every crease sat perfectly in place. 21 years in military intelligence had trained her to control every visible emotion, even when exhaustion pressed heavily against her chest. But the moment the hotel appeared beside the harbor, something old and painful tightened quietly inside her ribs. The Grand Harborton Hotel looked like a palace glowing against the gray rain. White columns stretched toward the cloudy sky while valets hurried guests beneath umbrellas and camera crews prepared equipment near the ballroom entrance. Of course, Caroline picked this place. Everything about her younger sister revolved around appearances. As soon as Rebecca stepped out of the car, she heard someone whisper nearby.
That must be the military sister.
Not Rebecca.
Not daughter. Not family. Just the military sister.
Rebecca smiled politely anyway. That was another thing the Army had taught her. You survive hostile rooms by refusing to let people see discomfort. Inside, the ballroom smelled like roses, expensive perfume, and polished marble. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm, golden light across hundreds of guests dressed in tuxedos and designer gowns, while a jazz trio played softly near the dance floor. Everything glittered. Nothing felt warm. Rebecca spotted her father almost immediately. Richard Hale stood near the bar, speaking with several businessmen. Silver hair, perfect tuxedo, controlled posture. He looked exactly like the man she remembered from childhood, emotionally distant and permanently concerned with appearances. For one brief second, Rebecca wondered whether age had softened him. Then he looked at her. No smile.
No pride.
No warmth. Only a short nod. Like she was another guest attending the wedding. Rebecca walked toward him anyway. "Hi, Dad."
"You're late."
She checked her watch automatically. "The ceremony starts in 40 minutes.
"You still could have come earlier."
Caroline stressed.
Of course she was.
Caroline believed attention belonged to her the same way sunlight belonged to the sky. "My flight landed an hour ago," Rebecca answered calmly. Richard's eyes moved slowly across her uniform. "You really wore that?" There it was. Not hidden, not softened. Immediate disappointment. "It's formal military protocol?" Rebecca replied evenly. "You could have worn a normal dress." Rebecca nearly laughed.
2 deployments overseas.
A Bronze Star. 21 years serving her country. And somehow the embarrassing thing was still the uniform. "I think Mom would have liked it," she said quietly. Richard's jaw tightened instantly. Even after 15 years, mentioning Rebecca's mother still unsettled him. Before he could answer, Caroline appeared beside them in a white satin gown that probably cost more than Rebecca earned during her first year in the Army. Blonde curls framed a flawless smile designed carefully for cameras. "Rebecca!" Caroline air-kissed her cheek without touching her. "You made it. Congratulations." "Oh my God, everybody's been talking about your outfit." Outfit, not service, not military career.
Just outfit.
Rebecca noticed one of the wedding videographers slowly drifting closer. Caroline noticed too. That felt intentional. "You're sitting at table 16, Caroline added casually. Rebecca glanced across the ballroom. Table 16 sat near the kitchen doors, the farthest table possible from the family section. Even distant relatives sat closer. Something cold slid quietly through Rebecca's stomach, but she only nodded. "Sounds good." Caroline almost looked disappointed by the calm reaction. She expected visible hurt. Caroline always preferred her cruelty witnessed publicly. "Well," she said sweetly, smoothing invisible wrinkles from her gown, "try not to disappear before cake this time." That landed closer than Rebecca expected. 5 years earlier, she had left Thanksgiving dinner after Caroline joked about soldiers having government-funded trauma during dessert. Richard laughed harder than anyone else at the table. Neither of them knew Rebecca had lost a 19-year-old soldier under her command only 2 weeks earlier. Some pain becomes too sacred to explain to careless people. "I'll stay," Rebecca answered quietly. Caroline smiled.
Triumphant.
Then she disappeared back into the crowd, greeting guests while photographers followed her across the ballroom like orbiting satellites. Rebecca stood alone for a moment, watching the room carefully. The whispers, the strange glances, the cameras positioned too perfectly, the way several relatives avoided eye contact completely. Years of intelligence work sharpened instincts most civilians never developed. And every instinct inside Rebecca suddenly whispered the same dangerous thought. This wedding wasn't simply uncomfortable. Something had been planned. And somehow, she already knew she was the target. The ceremony passed in a blur of organ music, fake smiles, and carefully rehearsed emotions. Rebecca stood when everyone else stood, smiled when photographers pointed cameras toward her, clapped when Caroline and Ethan kissed beneath the flower-covered altar. From a distance, she probably looked perfectly composed. That was the dangerous thing about military training. People stopped recognizing exhaustion when someone learned how to wear discipline like armor. By the time the reception officially began, the ballroom had transformed into a glowing performance of wealth and perfection. Waiters floated through crowds carrying champagne, while soft jazz echoed beneath crystal chandeliers. Rebecca sat quietly at table 16 beside distant acquaintances and business associates who barely spoke to her unless politeness required it. Nobody asked about her deployments. Nobody asked where she had been stationed. Nobody asked what 21 years in military intelligence had cost her. But they all noticed the uniform. That always happened. A waiter placed a glass of champagne beside her. "Thank you," Rebecca said softly. Across the ballroom, Caroline laughed loudly while photographers circled her and Ethan near the dance floor. Everything about her younger sister looked effortless. Perfect hair, perfect smile, perfect life. Rebecca used to wonder what it felt like to move through the world loved that easily. Then again, Caroline had never grown up needing to earn affection. Rebecca stared quietly into her champagne while old memories surfaced whether she wanted them to or not. After their mother died, everything inside the Hale household changed almost overnight. Richard Hale stopped being emotionally present. At first, Rebecca thought grief explained it. Then months passed. Then years. Eventually, she realized something far worse. Her father wasn't emotionally broken. He had simply decided which daughter still mattered.
Caroline received warmth,
attention, protection. Meanwhile, Rebecca became useful. Useful daughters paid bills. Useful daughters sacrificed quietly.
Useful daughters didn't complain.
At 16, Caroline received a brand new Mustang for her birthday. That same summer, Rebecca worked double shifts at a diner near Charleston Harbor, trying to save enough money for college applications. Richard told her the family couldn't afford tuition assistance. 6 months later, he bought Caroline a designer puppy because she'd been feeling sad. Rebecca learned early that fairness did not exist equally inside families, especially wealthy families obsessed with appearances. The music shifted near the ballroom dance floor while guests applauded the newlyweds. Rebecca barely noticed. Her mind had drifted years backward. At 18, she enlisted in the army partly because she wanted purpose, mostly because she needed escape. The night before basic training, her mother's old bedroom still smelled faintly like lavender lotion and dust-covered books. Rebecca remembered standing alone beside the window while Richard argued downstairs with debt collectors on the phone. The electricity had already been shut off twice that year. But somehow Caroline still attended private school wearing designer clothes. Rebecca joined the military 2 weeks later. Richard told relatives she enlisted because she was rebellious. He never mentioned the overdue mortgage notices stacked inside kitchen drawers. Over the years, Rebecca sent money home constantly. Every deployment, every promotion, every combat bonus. Money for Caroline's tuition. Money for medical bills. Money for Richard's struggling business. Money for emergencies that somehow always involved protecting Caroline's lifestyle. Once, during her second deployment overseas, Caroline called Rebecca crying hysterically through a satellite connection. "My card got declined," she sobbed dramatically. Rebecca sat inside a temporary operations tent in Afghanistan, listening to mortar fire in the distance. "What happened?" "I'm literally stranded." Where are you?" "A resort in Scottsdale." Rebecca closed her eyes slowly. "How much do you need?" $3,000. $3,000. Rebecca wired the money 2 hours later. 3 weeks afterward, one of her soldiers lost both legs from an IED explosion. Caroline never asked about him, never asked whether Rebecca was okay. Instead, she called again, asking if Rebecca could help cover luxury apartment expenses because Dad stressed again. At some point, Rebecca stopped feeling like a daughter. She became an emergency contact with a paycheck. Across the ballroom, Caroline suddenly locked eyes with her and smiled brightly for the cameras. Rebecca smiled back automatically. Military intelligence taught people how to perform calmness under pressure. But beneath the surface, something colder moved quietly through her thoughts tonight. Because the memories didn't feel random anymore. The whispers, the strange tension, relatives avoiding eye contact, even table 16. It all felt coordinated somehow, like everyone knew something she didn't. A shadow fell across her table. Rebecca looked up. Richard stood there holding a champagne glass. His expression remained unreadable. "We need to talk later," he said quietly. Rebecca studied him carefully. "About what?" "You'll see." Then he walked away before she could answer. Simple words. But something about them made the hairs rise slowly along the back of her neck. Because after 21 years serving around dangerous men, Rebecca trusted instincts more than explanations. And every instinct she had was suddenly screaming the same thing. Whatever waited for her tonight, it had already been decided long before she arrived. Dinner arrived beneath soft golden lighting and the sound of forced happiness. Guests laughed too loudly. Champagne flowed endlessly. The wedding band played old jazz standards, while servers carried expensive plates between tables like performers inside a carefully rehearsed production. Rebecca barely touched her food. Years of military work had trained her to recognize behavioral patterns quickly. And tonight, the ballroom felt wrong. Not chaotic, controlled. Like people were waiting for something. Every few minutes, Rebecca caught relatives glancing toward her before quickly looking away. Even strangers at nearby tables seemed aware of tension moving invisibly beneath the celebration. Across the ballroom, Caroline floated through crowds in her white satin gown, smiling for cameras, while Ethan followed behind her, looking increasingly overwhelmed. Poor guy. He still thought he married into a normal family. Rebecca reached for her champagne just as the music suddenly faded. A microphone squealed softly near the dance floor. The entire ballroom turned. Richard Hale stood beside the head table, holding a champagne glass in one hand and a microphone in the other. His posture looked calm, controlled, dangerously calm. Rebecca felt something inside her go completely still.
I'd like everyone's attention for just a moment, Richard announced smoothly.
The room quieted immediately. Beside him, Caroline smiled brightly, though something sharp flickered behind her eyes. Rebecca recognized that look.
Anticipation.
Richard slowly scanned the ballroom before speaking again.
Tonight is about family, he said. About honesty. About moving forward into new chapters with clarity.
Several guests nodded politely.
Rebecca didn't move.
Years in intelligence taught her something important about dangerous moments.
Sometimes survival means becoming very still.
Richard stepped away from the head table. Then he started walking directly toward her.
The ballroom seemed to inhale all at once. Every instinct inside Rebecca sharpened immediately. One of the videographers repositioned himself near table 16.
Another camera turned toward her face.
That wasn't accidental.
This had been planned.
Carefully.
Deliberately.
Richard stopped beside her chair.
For one brief second, father and daughter stared at each other in complete silence. Then he reached into his tuxedo jacket and removed a cream-colored envelope.
Heavy paper. Expensive paper.
The kind wealthy people use when they want cruelty to feel elegant. This, he said evenly, is from all of us. The room became silent in that terrible high society way, where people stopped speaking, not because they felt compassion, but because they sensed entertainment.
Rebecca accepted the envelope slowly.
Her pulse remained perfectly steady. That surprised even her. She could feel Caroline watching from across the ballroom almost desperately.
Waiting.
Hoping. Wanting tears. Rebecca opened the envelope carefully. Inside sat several folded pages covered in signatures. She immediately recognized Richard's handwriting. Then Caroline's. Then more names. Aunt Linda. Uncle Robert.
2 cousins.
Even relatives who barely spoke to her anymore. Rebecca unfolded the pages completely and began reading. Rebecca Hale. The letter began. After years of disappointment, emotional instability, hostility, and repeated embarrassment brought upon this family through your choices and behavior, we have decided it is healthiest to formally separate ourselves from you permanently. The ballroom remained deathly quiet. Even the band had stopped moving. We no longer consider you part of this family. You are asked not to attend future holidays, birthdays, anniversaries, or family gatherings. We request no further contact unless legally necessary. Rebecca kept reading, slowly, carefully.
Every word.
This decision has been made collectively and permanently.
Signed,
Richard Hale.
Caroline Hale Walker.
Multiple relatives beneath them. The final line nearly made Rebecca laugh.
We wish you peace elsewhere.
Elsewhere.
Like she had already been emotionally buried.
Rebecca lowered the pages slowly. Across the ballroom, Caroline stood perfectly still beside Ethan, trying and failing to hide the excitement trembling behind her smile. She wanted public humiliation. That had always been Caroline's favorite kind. Richard remained standing beside Rebecca's chair, waiting for the reaction everyone expected.
Crying.
Anger.
Begging.
A scene. But Rebecca only stared quietly at the signatures. Because suddenly everything made sense. The whispers. The cameras.
Table 16.
Relatives avoiding eye contact. This wasn't spontaneous cruelty. This was staged exile. And the truly pathetic part? They believed this letter gave them power. Rebecca folded the pages once, then twice, then slipped them calmly into her purse. Richard frowned slightly. Confused already.
Good.
Rebecca finally lifted her eyes toward him. Thank you, she said quietly. The confusion deepened around his expression.
For what?
Rebecca held his gaze steadily.
For finally putting it in writing.
A ripple moved through the ballroom. Tiny reactions, confused glances, nervous shifting.
This wasn't unfolding the way anyone expected.
Especially Caroline. Her smile flickered for the first time all evening. Richard crossed his arms. You should accept responsibility for your choices. There it was. The rewriting. The same family strategy they'd used for years. Hurt Rebecca first. Then frame her reaction as the real problem. But something inside Rebecca had changed permanently a long time ago. War changes people. Loss changes people. And once someone spends enough nights hearing mortars explode outside military barracks,
wealthy social cruelty stops feeling intimidating? Rebecca rose slowly from her chair. The entire ballroom tracked the movement instantly. Caroline stepped forward quickly. "Maybe we should discuss this privately," she said with forced laughter. Rebecca looked directly at her. "No," she answered calmly. "I think public honesty was your idea." Several guests visibly lowered their eyes. Even Ethan looked uncomfortable now. Richard's expression hardened. "Don't start something tonight." The irony nearly made Rebecca smile. Because he still believed he controlled the room. Still believed she was the frightened daughter desperate for approval. Rebecca reached for her champagne glass and took a slow sip. Then she looked at her father carefully for several long seconds. And for the first time in her life, Richard Hale looked uncertain. Nobody spoke for several long seconds. The ballroom sat frozen beneath golden chandelier light, while Rebecca calmly held her champagne glass beside table 16. Richard Hale remained standing across from her, but something subtle had changed in his posture now. He no longer looked confident. He looked cautious. Caroline noticed it too. That frightened her more than Rebecca's words. "Oh my God!" Caroline laughed suddenly into the microphone, though strain cracked beneath the sound. "Can we please not turn my wedding into another Rebecca drama situation?" A few nervous chuckles scattered weakly through the ballroom. Not many. People were uncomfortable now. Good. Rebecca slowly stepped away from her table, toward the center of the room, toward the microphones, toward the cameras Caroline had positioned so carefully earlier. Every eye followed her instantly. Caroline's smile tightened. "Rebecca," she warned softly. "You wanted honesty." Rebecca answered calmly. "I think honesty's fair." Ethan shifted awkwardly beside his new wife. "Maybe everybody should calm down, so—" "No," Caroline snapped too quickly. That caught Ethan's attention immediately. "Interesting?" Rebecca reached the center of the ballroom and gently took the microphone from Caroline's hand. The speakers hummed softly. For a moment, Rebecca simply looked across the room. Men in tuxedos, women wrapped in pearls and silk, relatives pretending not to stare, guests frozen halfway through expensive desserts. And suddenly, Rebecca realized she wasn't nervous anymore. She had briefed generals in war zones. She had informed parents their children weren't coming home. She had spent years surviving places where fear became background noise. Compared to that, this ballroom meant nothing. "I wasn't planning to say anything tonight," Rebecca began quietly. Silence. Real silence now, not performance silence. "Honestly, I almost didn't come." Several guests shifted uncomfortably. Rebecca continued calmly. "My sister and I grew up about 6 miles from here in a small white house near Rutledge Avenue." A faint smile touched her mouth. "My mother loved that house. She used to say broken things deserved patience." That softened the room immediately. Because grief sounds different when it comes from someone genuinely carrying it. Caroline crossed her arms. Rebecca barely noticed. "After Mom died, things changed?" Rebecca continued. Richard's jaw tightened visibly. "When I joined the army at 18, my father told people I enlisted because I was rebellious." A few guests smiled politely. Rebecca didn't. "The truth was, our electricity had already been shut off twice." The room became still, completely still. "I couldn't afford college," she continued quietly. "So I enlisted." Across the ballroom, Ethan slowly turned toward Richard. "Interesting." Rebecca kept speaking. "For years after that, I sent money home every month." She glanced briefly toward Caroline. "Tuition payments, mortgage payments, medical bills, car payments once." Caroline laughed sharply. "She's exaggerating." Rebecca looked directly at her. "I kept receipts." That landed heavily. You could physically feel the room changing now. Guests leaning emotionally away from the Hale family. Caroline's face lost color for the first time all evening. Richard stepped forward immediately. "You've always blamed this family for your own choices." There it was. The rewriting again. Rebecca almost admired how naturally he did it. As if manipulation had become reflex. She looked at him calmly. "You told relatives I became unstable after deployment." Richard's expression hardened instantly. "That's enough." "No," Rebecca answered softly. "Not yet." The ballroom remained completely silent. Even servers had stopped moving.
Rebecca took a slow breath before continuing.
5 years ago, I discovered multiple loans opened under my Social Security number.
Gasps rippled quietly across nearby tables.
Caroline froze. Ethan looked sharply toward her.
At first I assumed identity theft, Rebecca continued evenly. Then I found the signatures connected to Dad's business accounts. Richard's voice dropped lower.
Rebecca, warning,
Control.
intimidation.
Once upon a time, that tone would have terrified her. Not anymore. When I confronted him privately, Rebecca said calmly, he told me he was desperate. He promised he'd fix everything.
Several relatives visibly exchanged glances now.
Rebecca noticed Aunt Linda slowly lowering her eyes toward the tablecloth.
Interesting. So not everyone knew the full truth either.
Caroline stepped closer quickly. This is insane.
No,
Rebecca replied quietly. What's insane is spending years financially supporting people who quietly destroy your credit while telling everyone you're mentally unstable.
Ethan looked pale now. Actually pale.
His eyes moved slowly between Caroline and Richard as pieces began connecting inside his head. Rebecca recognized that expression immediately.
Betrayal becoming reality. Richard stepped toward her again. We are not discussing private family matters publicly.
Rebecca nearly smiled.
Then maybe you shouldn't have publicly handed me a disownment letter during dessert.
A woman near the back whispered, Jesus Christ! Someone else muttered, Did they really do that? Caroline's breathing had become visibly uneven now.
Good.
For years, she weaponized public humiliation against Rebecca because she believed her sister would always stay quiet to protect appearances.
But war had burned that weakness out of Rebecca a long time ago. She no longer feared embarrassment, not after everything else she'd survived.
Rebecca slowly reached down and touched her purse. Inside sat the letter,
and beneath it, something else,
something much more dangerous. Richard noticed the movement immediately. His face changed.
Very slightly,
but Rebecca saw it.
Fear.
Tiny.
New.
But real. For the first time in her entire life. Her father was beginning to understand he no longer controlled the story. And the truly terrifying part? Rebecca hadn't even started yet. The ballroom no longer felt like a wedding. It felt like the moment before a building collapsed. Nobody touched their food anymore. Conversations had completely died. Even the band members sat frozen near the stage, pretending not to stare, while Rebecca stood calmly beneath chandelier light, holding the microphone. Caroline's face had gone pale beneath layers of flawless makeup.
Richard still tried maintaining control through posture alone, but Rebecca could see the strain forming around his eyes now.
Good. For years he had relied on silence.
On intimidation.
On the belief that Rebecca would always protect the family image, no matter how badly they treated her. Tonight, that illusion was dying publicly. Ethan finally stepped forward beside Caroline.
What loans?
He asked quietly. Caroline immediately grabbed his arm.
Baby, don't do this here.
That's not what I asked.
His voice remained calm, but something important had changed underneath it.
Trust was cracking. Rebecca recognized the expression because she remembered wearing it herself 6 years earlier while staring at collection notices inside her tiny apartment near Fort Bragg. That moment when betrayal stopped being suspicion and became fact. Richard straightened his tuxedo jacket carefully.
She's taking private family issues and twisting them into some dramatic performance.
Rebecca almost laughed.
Performance.
Interesting word, coming from a man who publicly disowned his own daughter during wedding dessert. She looked directly at Ethan. I discovered the loans after a lender contacted me about missed payments, Rebecca explained calmly. At first, I thought somebody stole my identity. Ethan's eyes shifted toward Richard.
Rebecca continued. Then I found signatures connected to my father's business accounts.
Caroline stepped in immediately. She has no proof. Rebecca held her gaze. I spent 6 years collecting proof. Silence. Heavy silence. Ethan slowly looked back at his wife.
You knew about this.
Caroline blinked too quickly. No. Too fast. Too rehearsed. Rebecca saw Ethan notice it instantly. That tiny hesitation. That instinctive panic. Sometimes marriages die in moments smaller than shouting. Rebecca continued speaking before Caroline could recover. When I confronted Dad privately,
he cried. Several guests visibly reacted to that. Richard Hale didn't cry. Ever. He told me the business was failing. Said he was desperate. Said family sacrifices for family. Rebecca's voice remained calm. But inside, old anger moved quietly beneath years of discipline. I believed him because back then she still wanted love badly enough to mistake manipulation for vulnerability. She remembered sitting alone in her apartment after that conversation, staring at unpaid bills spread across her kitchen table. Richard promised he would fix everything. Instead, weeks later, relatives began calling Rebecca, asking whether she was mentally okay after deployment, whether the army had changed her, whether she needed help. Richard had protected himself the same way powerful men always protected themselves. Discredit the witness first, then nobody asks questions later. Aunt Linda suddenly lowered her wine glass. Richard, she said carefully. You told us she was having emotional problems. The entire room turned toward him. Richard's expression darkened instantly. She was unstable. Rebecca almost smiled. There it is. Caroline stepped closer toward Ethan again. She's been angry for years because Dad loved me more. The sentence landed like shattered glass. Several guests visibly winced, because some truths sound ugly even when spoken honestly. And the worst part? Caroline genuinely believed it. Rebecca looked at her quietly for several seconds. No, she answered softly. I hated what you became because of it. That hit harder. Caroline's face twisted immediately. You disappeared for years, she snapped. You abandoned this family. Rebecca stared at her calmly. Interesting word coming from people who mailed me a formal exile letter during dinner. A few guests actually looked embarrassed now. Not for Rebecca. For the Hale family. The emotional center of the room had shifted completely. And everybody felt it. Rebecca turned slowly toward Ethan. When I was deployed in Kandahar, she said quietly, I called home after one of my soldiers died. Caroline's expression tightened. You told me not to sound depressing because you were hosting a pool party. Complete silence. Even breathing sounded loud inside the ballroom now. Ethan stared at Caroline like he no longer recognized her. Caroline shook her head quickly. She twists everything. Rebecca ignored her. 3 weeks before that call, I wired her $3,000 because her credit card got declined at a luxury resort. Ethan slowly stepped backward. Not dramatic. Not loud. But that single movement hurt Caroline more than anything Rebecca had said all evening. Because for the first time in her life, someone was no longer automatically choosing her side. Richard finally lost patience. This has gone far enough? His voice cracked through the ballroom sharply enough to make several guests jump. But Rebecca didn't flinch. Years earlier, she would have. Years earlier, his anger still controlled her nervous system. Not anymore. War changes people permanently. So does betrayal. Rebecca looked calmly at her father. No, she said quietly. Actually, we're just getting started. Then she slowly reached into her purse. The movement alone changed the atmosphere instantly. Caroline stopped breathing. Richard's face lost color. And Ethan looked directly at Rebecca, like he already understood something terrible was about to happen. Because hidden beneath the disownment letter, Rebecca carried the one thing the Hale family feared most. Evidence! Nobody moved. The ballroom sat completely frozen while Rebecca slowly reached inside her purse beneath the warm chandelier light. Caroline's breathing had become shallow and uneven. Richard looked furious now, but underneath the anger, something else had finally appeared in his eyes. Fear. Tiny, controlled, but unmistakably real. Rebecca pulled out a thin black folder and held it calmly against her side. The room somehow became even quieter, because everybody understood instinctively that whatever sat inside that folder mattered. A lot. Richard took one sharp step forward. Put that away! His voice came lower now. Dangerous. The voice he used when Rebecca was younger, and he wanted immediate obedience. Once upon a time, that tone could stop her heartbeat instantly. Not anymore. Rebecca looked at him steadily. Too late. Then she opened the folder. Inside sat years of carefully organized documents separated by colored tabs. Bank statements, loan agreements, wire transfers, tax filings. business account records, forged signatures. 6 years of evidence. Guests began exchanging nervous looks immediately. Several people discreetly reached for their phones beneath the tables. Good. Let them record. Rebecca removed the first document carefully. This account, she said evenly, holding up a paper, was opened under my social security number while I was deployed overseas. Richard folded his arms tightly. You don't understand business accounting. A few guests shifted uncomfortably. Rebecca almost admired the reflex. Even cornered, he still tried reframing fraud as sophistication. She continued calmly. The account funded Hale Development Group during a liquidity crisis. Ethan looked sharply toward Richard. Caroline immediately grabbed his arm again. She doesn't know what she's talking about. Rebecca pulled out another document. This wire transfer covered the down payment on Caroline's first luxury condo in Atlanta. Caroline's face drained completely. That's a lie. Rebecca looked directly at her. The bank disagreed. Several guests audibly inhaled. Richard stepped closer again. You're embarrassing yourself. Rebecca almost smiled. No, she answered softly. I spent years embarrassing myself by protecting all of you. That landed heavily. Because deep down, everyone in the room suddenly realized something ugly. Rebecca had stayed quiet for years. Not because she lacked evidence, because she still loved them, and the Hale family weaponized that love against her. Rebecca removed another sheet from the folder. This signature belongs to my father. She placed the document directly onto a nearby table where several guests could clearly see it. Beside mine. A woman near the back whispered, "Oh my God!" Ethan stepped closer toward the papers slowly. Like someone approaching a car wreck. Rebecca continued speaking calmly. When I discovered the fraud, Dad promised he'd fix everything privately. Richard's jaw tightened visibly. But instead, Rebecca continued, he started telling relatives I became paranoid after deployment. Aunt Linda covered her mouth quietly. Rebecca looked at her gently. You remember those phone calls? Linda lowered her eyes immediately. Because she did remember. They all did. The careful whispers. Poor Rebecca. The army changed her. She's unstable now. Classic reputation destruction. Discredit first. Isolate second. Then nobody believes the victim later. Rebecca spent years studying psychological operations during intelligence work. She recognized manipulation because she had survived it personally. Caroline suddenly stepped toward the folder. You can't show private documents publicly. Rebecca closed the folder slowly before Caroline could touch it. Interesting concern, she said calmly, coming from someone who publicly disowned her own sister 15 minutes ago. A few guests looked down immediately. Even the wedding planner near the wall appeared horrified now. The illusion was collapsing too fast for anyone to stop it. Richard's voice hardened again. You've always been jealous of this family. Rebecca stared at him for several seconds. Then something inside her finally shifted. Not anger. Not sadness. Clarity. You know what's funny? She asked quietly. Richard said nothing. For years I thought maybe you were right. The room stayed completely silent. Rebecca looked around slowly. At some point, emotional neglect becomes normal enough that you stop asking what's wrong with your family. Her voice remained calm. You start asking what's wrong with you. That hit the ballroom differently. Because pain, spoken quietly, always feels more real than screaming. Even strangers looked uncomfortable now. Rebecca glanced down briefly at the folder in her hands, then back at her father.
But 6 years ago, something happened that changed everything.
Richard's face lost color instantly. Caroline noticed. And for the first time all evening, real panic appeared in her eyes. Rebecca, Richard warned carefully. She ignored him. I started documenting everything. She tapped the folder lightly. Every transfer. Every hidden account. Every forged signature. Every lie. Ethan looked physically sick now. Actually sick. His eyes moved slowly between Caroline and Richard, while the reality of the family he married into rearranged itself inside his head. Rebecca recognized that feeling too. The moment betrayal reorganizes your entire understanding of people you trusted. Caroline suddenly grabbed Ethan's wrist tightly. Baby, she's manipulating everybody. But Ethan gently pulled his hand away. That single movement shattered something inside Caroline's expression.
Good.
Rebecca looked calmly at her father again. The interesting thing about military intelligence, she said softly, is that it teaches patience. Richard didn't answer, because suddenly he understood exactly how dangerous patience could become. Rebecca slowly slid the folder back into her purse. Then she delivered the sentence she had imagined for 6 long years. "Before I arrived tonight," she said calmly, "complete copies of everything were mailed to my attorney, the IRS." She paused and looked directly into her father's eyes.
"And federal investigators."
The ballroom exploded into whispers, and Richard Hale finally looked afraid. The whispers spread through the ballroom like wildfire. Federal investigators,
ERS.
fraud, identity theft. The words moved between tables in horrified fragments, while guests stared openly now, no longer pretending discretion mattered. Richard Hale stood completely still near the center of the ballroom. But Rebecca noticed it immediately. His hands, tiny tremors near the cuff of his tuxedo sleeve. For most people, the shaking would have been invisible. Military intelligence trained Rebecca to notice details other people missed. Fear always reveals itself eventually. Caroline looked seconds away from panic.
"You're bluffing," she snapped.
Rebecca calmly set the microphone down on a nearby table. "No," she answered softly. "I prepared." There was a difference. Planning came from anger. Preparation came from survival. Ethan stared at Caroline like he no longer recognized the woman standing beside him.
"You knew about this?"
Caroline turned toward him immediately.
"She's twisting everything."
That's not an answer. His voice sounded quieter now, colder. The kind of voice people use when trust has already started dying. Caroline grabbed his arm desperately.
"Baby, please."
He pulled away gently.
Not dramatic. Not cruel.
But somehow that hurt her more than public humiliation ever could. Because for the first time in Caroline Hale's life, charm wasn't working. Richard finally stepped toward Rebecca again.
"This has gone far enough?"
Rebecca looked at him steadily.
"You publicly disowned your own daughter during your other daughter's wedding."
Richard's jaw tightened. "And now you're upset the evening became uncomfortable?" Several guests lowered their eyes immediately. A woman near the back whispered, "Jesus Christ." Then suddenly, the ballroom doors opened. Every head turned instantly. 2 men in dark suits stepped inside beneath the glowing chandeliers. Not loud, not dramatic. No flashing badges, no raised voices. Just calm expressions and the kind of quiet authority that changes the air in a room immediately.
The older man scanned the ballroom once before speaking.
"Mr. Richard Hale?" Complete silence. Even the band looked frozen. Richard cleared his throat slowly. "I think there's been some misunderstanding." Of course he did. That had always been his talent, not lying directly.
Reframing.
Softening. Turning betrayal into miscommunication. Turning theft into temporary necessity. Turning abuse into family tension. The older agent walked forward calmly.
"We only need a private conversation, sir."
Nobody in the ballroom believed that sentence meant anything good. Whispers exploded again across nearby tables. Caroline's face had completely lost color now. "This is insane," she hissed toward Rebecca. "You planned this." Rebecca almost smiled. "No, Caroline," she answered quietly. "I survived it." That landed harder than shouting ever could. Because survival implied something terrible had happened long before tonight. Ethan slowly rubbed both hands across his face. Then he looked directly at Caroline. "How much did you know?"
Wrong pause.
Caroline hesitated half a second too long. And that tiny hesitation destroyed everything. Rebecca watched realization move across Ethan's face in real time. Every strange conversation, every unexplained expense, every time Caroline avoided financial questions, every excuse suddenly rearranged itself into something uglier. "Ethan, and did you know?" Her eyes filled with tears instantly. Perfectly timed. Rebecca almost admired the reflex. Caroline weaponized tears the way politicians weaponized speeches. "I was protecting my family," she whispered. Rebecca nearly laughed. Protecting. Interesting word for people who publicly exiled someone during dessert. Richard's voice suddenly sharpened. We are not discussing family matters publicly. The older federal agent answered before Rebecca could. Then perhaps we should continue this conversation somewhere private. Several guests visibly shifted away from the Hale family now. That was the thing about wealthy social circles. Scandal itself wasn't unforgivable. Public scandal was, and tonight, the Hale family image was collapsing beneath chandelier light in front of 200 witnesses. Caroline suddenly turned toward Rebecca with genuine fury. You ruined my wedding! There it was.
Not remorse.
Not denial. Not concern about fraud. Only the wedding.
Only appearances.
Rebecca stared at her quietly for several long seconds. Then she answered with devastating calm. No. The ballroom became still again. Your lies ruined it long before I arrived.
Caroline looked like she might slap her.
But beneath the anger, Rebecca finally saw the emotion Caroline spent her entire life avoiding.
Fear. Real fear.
Because consequences had finally entered the room. One of the agents stepped closer toward Richard again.
Sir, we need you to come with us.
Nobody moved. Then Aunt Linda suddenly stood from her table. Her voice trembled slightly. Richard, everyone turned toward her. You told us Rebecca became unstable after deployment. Richard's face darkened immediately. Sit down, Linda. But she kept talking.
You said the letter would create healthy boundaries.
The shame in her voice spread visibly through the room. Because relatives were finally realizing how thoroughly Richard manipulated them too. Rebecca stood quietly watching everything unfold. And strangely, she didn't feel victorious. She felt tired. Years of anger no longer burned hot inside her. Only cold exhaustion remained. The younger federal agent quietly spoke into an earpiece near the ballroom entrance, while the older one remained focused on Richard.
For the first time in her entire life,
Rebecca watched her father look powerless.
no charm, no intimidation, no carefully managed reputation. Just an aging man standing inside the ruins of his own illusion.
Then Richard slowly turned toward Rebecca.
Hatred, humiliation, fear.
All of it moved together behind his eyes.
But beneath everything else, Rebecca saw one final emotion there too.
Regret. Not for what he had done.
For underestimating her.
And somehow, that hurt more than anything else tonight. Rebecca left the ballroom without looking back. Behind her, chaos continued beneath crystal chandeliers.
Voices overlapped. Guests whispered urgently. Someone dropped a champagne glass near the dance floor.
Caroline was crying now. Richard argued quietly with the federal agents near the entrance, while relatives stood frozen around untouched wedding cake and melting candles. But the moment the hotel doors closed behind Rebecca, the noise became distant, muted, like another world. Warm Charleston rain drifted softly through the night air, while harbor lights shimmered across black water nearby. For the first time all evening, Rebecca finally exhaled completely. Not because she felt safe, because she felt empty. Years of preparation, years of anger, years imagining this exact confrontation. And somehow the only emotion left now was exhaustion. Rebecca stepped beneath the covered hotel entrance and loosened the tight collar of her military uniform slightly. Her phone vibrated inside her purse. She stared at the screen for a moment before answering. Michael. Her attorney's voice came carefully through the phone. Rebecca, are you alone? She glanced back through the ballroom windows, where blurred figures still moved frantically beneath golden light.
Yes.
A pause. Then Michael lowered his voice. There's something else we uncovered. Rebecca leaned quietly against one of the stone columns near the valet stand.
Rain tapped softly against the pavement.
What is it? Another pause.
Then,
it's about your mother. Everything inside Rebecca immediately tightened. Even after 15 years, those words still carried weight capable of stopping her heartbeat.
Michael continued carefully.
Your mother created a second trust 6 months before she died. Rebecca frowned. That's impossible.
No,
he answered gently. It was hidden intentionally. She stared silently out toward Charleston Harbor, while cold rain drifted sideways through the wind. My father handled the estate? That's what he believed. Something about Michael's tone made Rebecca stand straighter instantly. Years of intelligence work sharpened instincts toward subtle tension in people's voices. What kind of trust? she asked quietly.
A conditional inheritance.
Rebecca's pulse slowed strangely. Military training sometimes did that under stress. Instead of exploding emotionally, her mind became colder, sharper.
What conditions?
Michael hesitated, then finally answered. The trust remained sealed unless you were formally separated from the Hale family. Silence. Complete silence. Rain continued falling softly around her. Inside the ballroom, shadows still moved frantically behind tall windows. Rebecca said nothing for several long seconds because her brain refused to fully process the sentence. The disownment letter triggered the release clause tonight, Michael continued quietly. Rebecca closed her eyes. For one painful moment, she couldn't breathe properly. Not because of money, not because of inheritance, because suddenly, something far deeper became horrifyingly clear. Her mother knew, long before Rebecca understood the truth herself. Her mother already saw exactly what the Hale family would eventually do to her. Tears burned unexpectedly behind Rebecca's eyes. The first real tears all night. She hadn't cried during the disownment letter, hadn't cried during the public humiliation, hadn't cried watching federal agents corner her father. But this broke something open inside her chest. What's in the trust? She asked quietly.
A lake house in northern Georgia, Michael answered. Investment accounts, several family heirlooms. He paused softly.
And letters. Rebecca covered her mouth briefly with trembling fingers. Letters.
God.
Suddenly, she remembered sitting beside her mother at the kitchen table as a little girl while Christmas music played softly through the house. Her mother writing cards carefully beneath warm, yellow light. Elegant handwriting slanting slightly left. Rebecca had almost forgotten that detail. There's more, Michael said carefully. Rebecca forced herself to answer.
Okay.
Your father discovered the trust years ago. Her eyes opened immediately.
What?
He attempted to challenge it legally after your mother died. Rebecca stared silently through the rain. But the attorney handling the trust refused disclosure because the conditions hadn't been met. A bitter laugh escaped her before she could stop it. So tonight, Michael exhaled quietly. Yes. Rebecca looked back toward the glowing ballroom windows again. Inside, Richard Hale still tried desperately to preserve whatever remained of his collapsing image. And somehow the irony felt almost unbearable. The same letter meant to publicly destroy Rebecca had accidentally handed her freedom instead. Michael's voice softened. Rebecca, I think your mother spent her final months trying to protect you. That finally shattered whatever emotional control remained. 2 tears slipped silently down Rebecca's face before disappearing into the rain. Because for most of her life, Rebecca believed nobody truly saw her.
Not really. Not completely.
But her mother did, even before Rebecca learned how dangerous silence inside a family could become. What do the letters say? Rebecca whispered. I haven't read them, Michael answered. They were addressed only to you. Rebecca closed her eyes again. For the first time in years, the crushing weight inside her chest shifted slightly. Not gone.
Never gone.
But lighter somehow. Because maybe she had not been unloved her entire life. Maybe one person understood her completely. And loved her enough to prepare for the day everything finally fell apart. By sunrise, the wedding scandal was already spreading online. Somebody uploaded cell phone footage less than an hour after the federal agents entered the ballroom. Then another guest posted Rebecca standing in her military uniform while Richard handed her the disownment letter. Then another, and another. By morning, Charleston's social media pages exploded with headlines. Decorated Army officer publicly disowned at sister's wedding. Federal investigators arrive during luxury wedding reception. Wealthy Charleston family accused of fraud and identity theft. The internet devoured the story instantly because people loved watching powerful families collapse publicly, especially beautiful ones. Rebecca woke the next morning inside her quiet hotel room overlooking the harbor. Rain still drifted softly across Charleston, turning the city gray beneath low clouds. Her phone sat beside the bed, vibrating nonstop. Missed calls, unknown numbers, news requests, relatives, even former classmates she hadn't spoken to in years. Rebecca ignored all of them. For the first time in decades, silence felt more comforting than explanation. She walked slowly toward the window wearing an oversized army sweatshirt and stared down at the harbor below. Tourists moved normally through the streets. Coffee shops opened. Boats crossed the water. Strange how ordinary the world looked after entire lives exploded overnight. Her phone buzzed again. This time she answered. Michael. Her attorney sounded exhausted already. It's getting bigger. Rebecca leaned against the window quietly. How bad? A pause. Federal investigators froze 3 Hale development accounts this morning. Rebecca closed her eyes briefly. That was fast. Michael continued. 2 business partners already pulled out publicly. Of course they did. Wealthy people tolerated cruelty. They did not tolerate legal exposure. And Richard? He's denying everything. Rebecca almost smiled sadly. Naturally. Richard Hale would keep protecting appearances until the walls physically collapsed around him. What about Caroline? Another pause. She deleted all her social media accounts overnight. That almost made Rebecca laugh. Caroline spent half her life building online perfection. Now she was hiding from comment sections. Interesting. Michael's voice softened slightly. There's more! Rebecca already knew she wouldn't like the tone. What? Ethan left. Silence. Rebecca stared down toward the harbor again while cold rain streaked the glass. He left the hotel around 3 this morning. Rebecca pictured Caroline standing alone inside that destroyed ballroom after guests finally went home. Mascara ruined, wedding dress wrinkled, perfect life collapsing publicly around her. Strangely, Rebecca didn't feel satisfaction, only distance, because revenge sounds emotionally satisfying until it finally arrives. Then mostly it just feels sad. What happens now? She asked quietly. Investigators are digging through everything. Your evidence opened multiple financial reviews. Michael paused. And Rebecca, your father's attorney contacted me. That surprised her slightly. What did he want? To negotiate? Rebecca laughed softly under her breath. Not cruelly, just tired. After years of calling her unstable, emotional, dramatic, now they wanted negotiation. Power changed language quickly. No, she answered calmly. Michael sounded unsurprised. I figured. After ending the call, Rebecca showered slowly and packed her suitcase in silence. Every movement inside the hotel room felt strangely detached, like she had emotionally stepped outside her own life overnight. Halfway through packing, another knock sounded at the door. Rebecca froze briefly, then opened it. Ethan stood outside wearing yesterday's wrinkled tuxedo pants and a dark sweater. He looked exhausted, older somehow. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Finally, Ethan lowered his eyes slightly. I'm sorry. Simple words, but sincere ones. Rebecca stepped aside quietly. He entered the room slowly. I didn't know, he admitted. Rebecca nodded once. I figured. Ethan rubbed both hands across his face tiredly. She told me you hated the family because you were jealous. Rebecca almost smiled. That probably made things easier for her. Pain flickered across his face immediately, because deep down, he already knew how true that was. He walked toward the harbor window silently. Was any of it real? He asked quietly. Rebecca considered lying, but exhaustion had burned politeness out of her. She loves attention, Rebecca answered honestly. I'm not sure she understands love outside of that. Ethan looked down. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then finally, I filed for annulment this morning. Rebecca blinked slowly. That was fast. I married someone I don't recognize. That hurt more than anger somehow. Because betrayal destroys identity before it destroys relationships. Ethan turned toward her again. She looked relieved when your father blamed everything on you last night. Rebecca said nothing, because she remembered that look too. The comfort Caroline always found in being chosen over someone else. Ethan swallowed hard. Nobody should look relieved while watching their sister suffer. Silence settled quietly between them. Then Ethan looked directly at Rebecca. Your mother would have been proud of you. That almost broke her. Because unlike Caroline, unlike Richard, unlike the rest of the Hale family, Ethan sounded genuine. Rebecca looked away quickly toward the harbor before emotion could fully surface. After a moment, Ethan moved toward the door, then stopped. They're still trying to control the story publicly, he said softly.
Your father's telling people you manipulated everything." Rebecca almost smiled. "Of course he is." Ethan nodded once, then finally said the words nobody in her family had ever truly given her before. "You deserved better." The door closed softly behind him. Rebecca stood alone inside the hotel room, listening to rain against the windows. And for the first time in years, she realized something unexpected. She no longer wanted the Hale family to love her. Because freedom and longing cannot survive inside the same heart forever. 6 weeks later, Rebecca drove north through the mountains of Georgia beneath a sky painted gold with early autumn light. The farther she traveled from Charleston, the lighter her chest began to feel. Not healed. Not completely, but quieter. The roads curved through forests glowing with orange leaves, while cold mountain air drifted through the cracked window of her SUV. For most of her adult life, silence had felt lonely. Now it felt peaceful. Michael had finalized the paperwork 3 days earlier. The lake house officially belonged to her. Rebecca almost laughed the first time she heard that sentence. Belonged to her. Nothing in the Hale family had ever truly belonged to Rebecca before. Not emotionally, not financially, not safely. By late afternoon, she finally turned onto a narrow gravel road surrounded by pine trees. Then she saw it. The lake house, small, white, simple, nothing like the enormous polished homes Richard Hale always preferred. The house sat quietly beside a glassy lake, surrounded by woods and silence. No photographers, no chandeliers, no performance, just peace. Rebecca stepped out slowly, breathing cold pine air while leaves drifted across the ground around her boots. For several long seconds, she simply stood there, listening to the water move gently against the dock. And suddenly, something inside her cracked open. Because for the first time since she was 18 years old, nobody expected anything from her. Inside, the house smelled faintly like cedarwood and old books. Soft afternoon light stretched across hardwood floors, while dust floated quietly through the air. Everything felt warm. Lived in. Loved. Rebecca slowly walked into the kitchen, then stopped completely. 5 envelopes rested neatly on the wooden table beside the window. Each one carried the same elegant handwriting she remembered from childhood. Rebecca. Her mother's handwriting slanted slightly left, exactly the way she remembered. Rebecca sat down slowly at the table, while her hands began trembling for the first time in weeks. Not from fear, from grief. She carefully opened the first envelope. The paper inside smelled faintly old, like forgotten drawers in time. Rebecca, if you are reading this, then something finally happened that I prayed never would. Tears instantly blurred her vision. She kept reading. I know your father better than you do. I know how easily strong daughters become targets inside weak families, especially daughters willing to sacrifice themselves for love. Rebecca pressed trembling fingers against her mouth. Outside, wind moved softly through pine trees beside the lake. Inside the quiet kitchen, 15 years of buried grief slowly surfaced all at once. Her mother's letters stretched across hours. Stories from childhood Rebecca barely remembered. Advice, family history, apologies, so many apologies. I should have protected you more. That line nearly shattered her completely. Because all her life, Rebecca secretly wondered why her mother never stopped the favoritism growing inside the Hale family before she died. Now she finally understood. Her mother saw it happening and spent her final months trying desperately to leave Rebecca a way out. One sentence from the 3rd letter stayed with Rebecca longer than anything else. One day they will mistake your silence for weakness. Let them. Rebecca read the line 3 times, then 4. And suddenly everything made sense. The years she stayed quiet. The years she endured humiliation without retaliation. The years Richard and Caroline mistook patience for helplessness. They never understood something crucial. Silence is not surrender. Sometimes silence is preparation. Rebecca carried the final letter outside just before sunset and walked slowly down the wooden dock behind the house. The lake reflected orange and gold beneath the fading sky, while cold air moved gently across the water. She sat alone at the edge of the dock, reading her mother's final words beneath the sound of evening wind. You were never difficult to love, Rebecca. They were simply too broken to love you correctly.
That finally broke the last wall inside her. Rebecca cried quietly beside the lake, while darkness slowly settled across the mountains. Not dramatic crying, not angry crying, grieving, releasing, healing. For years she believed survival meant becoming emotionally untouchable. But sitting there beside the water, Rebecca finally understood something deeper. Strength was never the ability to endure endless pain silently. Real strength was learning when to stop begging for love from people incapable of giving it. Far away in Charleston, the Hale family continued collapsing beneath investigations, scandal, and consequences. Richard's business offices closed permanently before winter. Caroline disappeared almost entirely from public life after the annulment became official.
Relatives occasionally attempted contacting Rebecca. She never answered.
Not from hatred, from peace, because revenge was never truly the point. Freedom was. The disownment letter handed to Rebecca beneath ballroom chandeliers was meant to destroy her publicly.
Instead, it released her. And as darkness settled quietly across the lake, Rebecca realized something that once felt impossible. For the first time in her life,
she no longer needed her family's approval to feel whole.